next speaker, who is Guy Collis, a Unison policy officer with responsible for health and social care, and he's going to give us an overview of where things stand with SubCos today. Thanks very much.
Thanks very much. I'll stay seated for the purposes of being on the screen. So, but thanks to all the organisers, but particularly, as has already been said, thanks to Marion and Jan for all the work on this, because I think it's one of those quite niche, knotty sort of issues that isn't obvious for people to get a hold of. It's not a straight question of job cuts or a more basic privatisation. So I think anything which helps popularise it and keep the issue sort of front and centre is really welcome. But I suppose I should say, in the nicest way possible, it's a shame that there needs to be an event like this, really, because I was there at that last launch. It was at Unison headquarters back in 2019, and that was kind of the sort of peak of the last wave of subcos. And at that point in time, trade unionists, health campaigners were fighting a kind of series of local battles against subcos across England. It's fair to say, I think back then we had a good deal of success. A number of these were held back or defeated, or there was major compromises made on them. And this was as a result of a kind of combination of different things, really. There was industrial action, there was campaigning strategies, there was protests, there was a lot of media work. But as a result, we had subco plans fell apart at places as varied as Bristol and Bradford, Leicester, Rotherham, Wigan, and as Jan just alluded to, when COVID came in, the last of that wave kind of hit the dirt at Frimley. So it really came as quite a surprise when we got to this point in March this year. That's already been mentioned when Jim Mackey made his announcement. In the gap in between there, NHS England had been forced to change their guidance again because of this big surge against the subcos. They'd essentially made the hurdles higher for trusts to jump over, and they brought in a new set of staff guidance, which the unions were able to have input to. So in theory, at least, it should have been much harder for trusts to go about trying to set up subcos. So it was quite a shock when Mackey made an announcement, and almost immediately we were confronted with a whole swathe of new subco projects. So I'll just say a little bit about what we did at Unison, working with the other unions and campaigners to fight back against it, what the situation looks like now, and then a kind of few thoughts about where things might be going in the future. So the Mackey announcement prompted a 6-month period of intense campaigning at Unison. In the first instance, we wrote to every trust leader in the country, reminding them, firstly, of the reasons why staff would oppose these plans. So, namely, that it was breaking them away from their parent trust. It was disrupting the team ethos that the NHS depends on, and it was making them vulnerable to future threats to their terms and conditions, which has already been referred to by Rathi, but also to this idea that full privatisation then became more likely. They were, by definition, being held at arm's length from the main NHS, and therefore potentially easier for them to have their employment sold off entirely. But we also reminded the trust leaders of the previous action that had been taken before, on the basis that that they weren't going to have an easy ride if this was the route they chose to go down. And helpfully, the Health Service Journal picked this up as well. They had a headline which said, "Union standoff with Mackey over subcos," or some words to that effect, which was obviously helpful because there's leadership, the audience of HSJ is very much those NHS leaders who might be looking at doing this type of thing. Then we set about analysing the kind of business cases, the plans which the trusts had put together to try and justify these new plans, particularly places like Newcastle and Dorset at this point. as was the case previously, these business plans were extremely flimsy. They're based on conjecture rather than evidence, and these figures which are kind of magicked out of thin air. There's no sort of basis for where they come from. We also tested the limitations of the subco approvals process, because as a result of those changes that happened after the first wave, it meant that if a group of staff or a union complained, then NHS England was obliged to host a meeting with the unions and the trust. We also worked, as you would expect, with MPs and councillors, particularly the new intake of Labour MPs, to challenge some of these subco plans on the ground, but also to try and bring pressure to bear on ministers themselves. We work closely with other unions, colleagues from Unite and GMB in particular, and with health campaigners. And I know that the KOMP branch in Dorset was particularly active in the campaigning down there. Where Dorset is concerned, the union launched a big advertising campaign, which was on buses and local transport around the area. There was a series of protests as well, including demonstrations at board meetings, and this was accompanied by a big organising push on the ground as our branch sort of laid the groundwork for industrial action. Meanwhile, nationally, we tried to escalate the work we were doing and targeting the government directly for their sort of apparent failure to keep NHS England in check. It felt like Mackie had just been given the go-ahead because of his previous experience with subcos in the north of England. And this included a series of attack pieces in the media and highly critical motions at TUC Congress and one to Labour Party conference. In these, we highlighted the fact that the push for subcos directly contradicted what was in the Labour Party manifesto, particularly when it came to things like the biggest wave of insourcing. This was going in entirely the different direction. Of course, we would get these arguments from trusts that if they didn't go down the subco route, they would have to outsource fully, and therefore a subco was a preferable option. And we've heard that many times in the last round of these, and particularly this time. But we also made the point that the government couldn't hide behind this being an NHS England thing, because these decisions were taking place on their watch. Then sort of, depending on your viewpoint, we were either very strategic or very lucky with our timing, because the Dorset strike action, the ballot result came in just days before Labour Party conference, and it delivered a massive 94% vote in favour of action, with 3/4 of the people eligible voting. So shortly after that, yeah, well, I mean, I say lucky in terms of the timing, but that wasn't a question of luck. That was down to the hard work of the activists and members on the ground, delivering that sort of vote. So then finally, at the end of September, just before Labour Party conference, we got this policy change that's already been referred to. And it outlined NHS England's plan to produce new guidance so that any subsidiaries involving the transfer of NHS staff would have to, and this is to quote, would only be approved where there was clear union support. And, we don't really expect that to ever happen. They announced there would be a consultation on the changes, but crucially, in the interim, any of the existing plans would have to be paused, unless, of course, they could again demonstrate union support. We also had confirmation from health ministers themselves to unions to confirm that the change of policy had taken place. So this was a big win. We did celebrate it as you would expect. It was a combination of political work, media work, and then that kind of industrial threat at the local level that forced a change. It meant that NHS England and government ministers had to listen to what the NHS staff themselves had to say. And so then a week later, the Dorset plan, the leaders there abandoned their plan. And then shortly afterwards, a number of other subco plans either were dropped entirely or was kind of quietly sidelined. But in terms of where this leaves us now, unfortunately, the subcos is a bit like one of those, the sort of bogeyman in a horror film. You know, they refuse to be killed off. It doesn't matter what happens. There always seems to just be this sort of idea that they're coming back again. And that is still the case. That point's already been made, I think. So we know that several trusts are still looking at these options. Others seem to think that their plans are merely on hold while we wait for this consultation process to happen. That hasn't been launched yet, but we are expecting it, so that will happen at some point. There continue to be rumours that the VAT loophole that is the reason for this being so attractive, that loophole will be closed, but we still haven't got any clarity on that, whether from NHS England themselves or from the Treasury. And as been said before, we know the extreme financial distress that many trusts are in. So there are many people who feel like they have to do whatever they possibly can to somehow pinch a few pounds. So I think the challenge for unions and campaigners remains. Vigilance is essential, and we need to be ready to go, just as we were last year. I'll just to finish, and I was particularly asked to mention something on this, was to update you on one other action we took last year, which has just recently come to fruition. Something I grew increasingly agitated about when reading these business cases is this idea that a new subco would have all these wonderful additional benefits for the NHS, that they would find some newfound entrepreneurial streak and they'd go out there and hunt down and win this new business. But of course, these sort of assertions were never accompanied by anything as boring as actual evidence or any suggestion that they tested the market to find out how these subcos were going to plug these supposed gaps. So we commissioned some research to kind of test this case, to work out if there was any basis in reality for these claims that the trusts were making. This was done by Trinava Consulting. The report came out last month. You can read it on the Unison website. I'm not giving away too much by saying to you that the report found there was virtually nothing to be gained for the NHS in terms of external business from using subsidiary companies. It kind of confirmed our sort of working hypothesis. Instead, much of the profit made by the existing subcos comes from offering new staff inferior pension arrangements, again, which has already been mentioned. So in terms of where we go from now, I think as well as highlighting these kind of findings to NHS England and trying to draw trusts' attention to them as well if they're planning new subcos, we also hope that this type of work can begin to sort of pave the way for a renewed focus on insourcing as well, highlighting the kind of two-tierism for staff that's inherent in this whole subco model. And so ultimately bringing staff employed by subcos back fully into the NHS, where we know they all belong. So thanks very much.